Hi, and welcome back to EAV 300, Virtues in the Public Square. And today we're going to talk about the virtue of courage. This is a unique lesson in many ways. One reason for that is that many thinkers throughout history have considered courage to be the animating force behind all of the virtues. In other words, that without courage, none of the other virtues would ever be actualized. No one would ever put them into practice. And so courage has many dimensions, both inner and outward. And I think we'll all benefit from this very deep discussion today. So first, you're going to hear from Professor Alan Mittleman on courage in Judaism. And then you'll hear from Professor Father Thomas Joseph White. And then you'll hear from Carl Sharif El-Tobgui on courage in Islam. And we want to say a special thank you to Father Thomas Joseph White because he not only agreed to come and participate in our course sort of at the last minute, but also he was a major driving force behind the organization of our May 2021 symposium at the University of Chicago. He helped us in planning and conceptualizing and in connecting with many of the scholars, even though he wasn't able to participate personally. So after you listen to these three very profound presentations, I'll see you on the other side where we'll listen to a conversation that I had with them. Thank you and happy viewing.
Job is to talk about courage in Judaism. I think over the millennia, when Jews were often persecuted, it took a great deal of courage to be a Jew. But for some reason, which we have to explore, the topic of courage really does not become thematic in Jewish texts. There's no go-to text that you can discover that talks about courage. We have to look at it somewhat obliquely. So I want to understand why this should be, this relative absence of courage as a distinct term, as a distinct concept in Jewish texts. There are books from the Middle Ages, early modernity, for example, that are books of ethics that list catalogs of desirable character traits. And as far as I can tell, courage is never among them. That doesn't mean that courage isn't a desirable character trait or a virtue. It just means it hasn't been really thematized in the Jewish literature. So let's think about why that is. First off, I think I'm going to read a text. The text is from Deuteronomy chapter 20, which talks about when the people Israel enter the land and they will undertake war. And it says, when you take the field against your enemies and see horses and chariots, forces larger than yours, have no fear of them, for the Lord your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, is with you. Before you join battle, the priest shall come forward and address the troops. He shall say to them, "Hear, O Israel, you are about to join battle with your enemy. Let not your courage falter. Do not be in fear or in panic or in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who marches with you to do battle for you against your enemies, to bring you victory." So here's a biblical text that tells the Israelites not to be courageous, but rather not to be cowardly. It doesn't address it head on, it addresses it inversely, so to speak. I think what it really, I might mention that the Hebrew is not really identifiable as courage. That's a modern interpretation. It says, if your heart becomes faint. But what the Israelite going into battle is supposed to focus on here, I would say, is not the virtue of courage, but the virtue of faith. That is, one is supposed to be completely reliant on God and to believe that the cause is righteous and that one will come through the battle because one has faith, not necessarily because one has courage. And we see this later in the same chapter, where it goes on to talk about certain categories of persons who should be excused from battle. Someone who's planted a vineyard, someone who's just gotten married, they should not have to go into battle until they get to enjoy their vineyard, their marital state. But then it says, the officials shall go on addressing the troops and say, is there anyone afraid and disheartened? Let him go back to his home, lest the courage of his comrades flag like his. So again, it's not telling people to be courageous so much as it's telling them that they shouldn't be discouraging to others. There's no time to talk about the medieval commentaries on this, which I think develop richness that you don't quite see on the surface, but this would be one place you could go, Deuteronomy 20 and its commentaries, to find perspectives on courage in Judaism. What we see in this text, I think, is already a turn in the Bible, in a text that talks about war, really a turn away from war, a turn away from a martial context for understanding the excellence or the virtue of courage. It is already a turn toward faith in God, trust, reliance on God, rather than anything that has to do with trust, faith, or reliance in yourself. I think this is part of why courage gets to be problematic in Judaism, because it is a quintessential virtue that one can cultivate out of one's own resources. It is the celebration of one's own strength, the affirmation of one's own bravery. And this just doesn't work in a religious system that's all about humility. It's all about trusting a higher power and not finding the source of your confidence in yourself. So this is one reason I think that Judaism is not primarily in the business of cultivating courage as a virtue. In Rabbinic Judaism, following on after the Bible, there's really a strong turn away from anything martial, anything warlike. Even a text in the Talmud that looks at King David when he was a warrior, when he goes into battle against the Philistine Goliath. The Bible talks about him as a courageous person, as a warrior, although someone who knows he'll be victorious because of God, not because of himself. But in the hands of the rabbis, that already has to do with with really deprecating the warrior as a martial figure and playing up the warrior as a kind of wise and able sage who can do battle for the truth of the Torah against other scholars doing the same thing. I mean, there's really this hard turn against a sort of worldly understanding of what courage is that might come out of the Greek tradition or the Roman tradition or something like that. So this, I just want to put this out there as a background to anything else we can say about courage. One of the consequences of this is that courage moves from anything external in coping with the adversities of life to something very much internal. And one of the classic rabbinic texts says, who is a gibor? This is related to the term gevurah, which means strength, sometimes translated as courage. But who is a hero, really? Who is a gibor? One who masters his evil inclination. So it's a kind of internal struggle with the refractory elements of one's soul, rather than something you manifest in a literal field of battle or even in a metaphorical field of battle. It's not to say that it doesn't take courage to be a Jew, or it never took courage to live in exile or stand up for a minority faith or anything like that. It's just to say that it hasn't been thematized. But as a friend of mine likes to point out, long before people had a word for gravity, gravity had a big effect in the world and on our lives. So just as Judaism, biblical or rabbinic Hebrew doesn't have a word for rights, I think rights can nonetheless characterize ethics in Judaism. It's a way of looking at things. Where you do find the word courage and thinking about courage is in the philosophical strain of medieval and modern Judaism. And this is not an accident, because in the philosophical strain, they've learned from the Greeks. So if you look in Maimonides, for example, Maimonides talks explicitly about courage. And his job is to sort of take this pretty much Aristotelian view of courage as a mean between a kind of crackpot bravery and cowardice, and adapt that to this biblical, monotheistic, rabbinic system. Similarly, you find a discussion of courage in Spinoza, but Spinoza sort of walked off the reservation, so to speak. But Spinoza channels Maimonides, and you find it in the modern early 20th century Jewish thinker in the German sphere, Hermann Cohen. In the little time that remains, I'll just say something about Maimonides and about Cohen. Both of them, I think, influenced by Greek sources, construe courage not just as a personal excellence, but as a political virtue, or I think we would say a civic virtue. Maimonides tells us in the Guide for the Perplexed that God made the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years until their souls became courageous. It being well known that life in the desert and lack of comforts for the body necessarily develop courage, whereas the opposite circumstances necessarily develop cowardice. Maimonides goes on to talk about the courage of the prophets, standing against the people of their society and bringing God's word to them at risk of their own lives. So Maimonides construes courage as, I would say, a virtue of the leader, a virtue of leadership, such as a prophet, but also as a virtue of citizenship, as it were. That is, in order to be a strong, engaged, responsible member of the body politic, you need to be somebody who didn't grow up in Egypt. You need to be somebody who's been toughened by the desert, because it's tough stuff to be a member of a polity and act with responsibility. Hermann Cohen similarly talks about courage. He very much draws on Greek tragedy, on Aeschylus, and he sees the tragic hero as a courageous figure, but then he wants to shift that Greek discussion into a Jewish mode, and he talks about the prophet as a kind of tragic figure, bringing a message that is often not understood, at risk of his own life, but ultimately standing up for politics of radical public justice and being willing to suffer for it. The prophet's idealism, according to Hermann Cohen, the prophet's courage is realizing ethical ideals in history. And he develops that. There's, I'd say, in sum, courage has an ambiguous status as a virtue in Judaism. Jewish teaching on courage valorizes it to the extent that it serves the highest ethical purposes as envisioned by the religious tradition. Its most distinctive features, the fortitude required to stand for the right, to stand against evil and evildoers, to fight and sacrifice on behalf of the most morally serious causes, are justified in terms of other virtues, primarily trust in and reliance on God. Its purely immanent origins in human nature are treated with some suspicion. To an extent, this is the product of a moral tradition that became highly critical of politics and force, but it is also a realization that the virtues are tied to a vision of life, and that for the best vision, one needs a wise ethical tradition. So I would say courage, to the extent it's thematically a virtue in Judaism, is only so because of the larger moral framework in which it is embedded. I think it's possible for evil people serving evil causes to be courageous. That's a problem we'll have to discuss. That's why the larger moral vision, I'd say the reliance in and trust in God, is needed to sort of channel courage to its best effect.
Okay, so what I'd like to try to talk about briefly here in the next 10 minutes or so is a Christian conception of courage. And as you can imagine, there isn't simply one, but I'll focus on that of Thomas Aquinas because it's very clearly presented and it represents many elements of the tradition. So, to talk about courage in Catholic Christianity as it's depicted by Thomas Aquinas, let me start with Aristotle's depiction, because though they're not identical, there are some interesting places of contact. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Aristotle looks at virtues that govern human happiness, the developed pursuit of human happiness, and the virtuous life. And he looks at courage as a mean between extremes, where you're trying to avoid rashness or daring that's unreasonable and imprudent or misbegotten. And on the other hand, you have excessive cowardice or the fear of engagement in view of the legitimate good. And what reason has to do is govern free actions in view of authentic goods, in view of the pursuit of happiness and justice, in ways that avoid these two extremes. And to do that, you have to manage what could be called in the tradition the irascible passions like fear or despair of achieving the difficult good, and instead govern yourself with ardor. And Aristotle says you have to do two things primarily to have courage. You have to endure an adversarial evil or a difficulty, and you have to also then be also willing to go on attack or to engage. Now, go on attack is language that's sometimes used, but it's more broad. It means to sort of embrace the situation that is difficult with fearlessness and ardor in such a way as to achieve the difficult good or to aim toward it. Now, interestingly, Aristotle says it pertains to fortitude or courage, more particularly to endure evils or practice long suffering than it does to go into engagement. Because often to pursue the good, you have to be patient under difficult circumstances and endure things. And that's actually more fittingly what is proper. Now, Aristotle also says that the most properly courageous act is to engage in battle in the danger of death, because that's where things become most acute. You might say that's the archetypal or primary analogate for Aristotle of courage. It's to be in battle where one can lose one's life for the good of the city, and one seeks not to do so, but instead to protect and defend the city. And that also just opens up that notion of the larger common good of the city, the idea that for him, prudence is framed within a larger context. Fortitude is framed within a larger context of prudence, of seeking the authentic good, for many, and it serves other higher, you might say, virtues of justice and prudence. Now, whether Aristotle gets those higher virtues completely correctly or not is another great question. But let me pass to Aquinas. Aquinas inherits the Aristotelian canon, but of course he's embedded already in a deeper framework of Judeo-Christian tradition. And in a way that Professor Mittleman has underscored, in the Old Testament, you do see, or what Christians call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, you see depictions of bravery and fortitude, but they are often in the context of giving witness to belief in the covenant God has established with Israel, and they can be in the context either of the defense of Israel and the battle, that's the battles that are enacted. But they can also be in the cases, a witness to martyrdom in the Catholic Bible, which comes from the Septuagint. There's the books of the Maccabees, which depict martyrdoms that are very courageous on the part of the people of the ancient Hebrew covenant. So Aquinas already sees, as has been mentioned, that there's a kind of higher bravery or fortitude being practiced here, subservient to and infused with faith, with hope in God, the God of the covenant, with love of the God of the covenant. And then the other thing he inherits is, of course, all the examples of martyrdom of the apostolic testimony of the New Testament and the Roman martyrs and the sort of hagiography around martyrdom of Christians in the first 3 centuries, especially under the auspices of the Roman Empire. And there are treatises on martyrdom like that of Cyprian of Carthage from the 3rd century that are very influential, which he'll cite in the Summa. Okay, so he's trying to understand, what does it mean to display courage as a person who is either in the older or New Testaments animated by faith, hope, and charity. And these are, of course, what he considers not natural cardinal virtues, but supernatural virtues that are gifts, they're grace. They're not something we can procure by our own powers and nature. In fact, he thinks our nature without grace is wounded, fragile, and that the irascible passions tend to overwhelm reason often, and we're overly moved by either excessive fear or anger or imprudent, unreasonable forms of aggression, or more typically by weakness and cowardice or a lack of ardor in pursuing the good. So we're weakened in our nature, and we don't have the privileges of grace such that we could live in faith, hope, and charity with the living God of the covenant, with God as he's revealed himself in the New Testament. But with grace, we can do that, and then we can establish this kind of new life of love of God, in which the ardor of the love of God can become the mechanism, or you might say, the deepest inspiration for genuine self-giving to God and for the sake of others. Now, here's where the interesting things start to happen, which I'll try to summarize briefly. The first is Aquinas sees the prototypical act of courage now in the supernatural motive of giving one's life to God and to others, even in the face of the threat of death and the suffering of bodily martyrdom, bodily death for the sake of the witness to God and to Christ. And this, act of martyrdom is an action, you might say, in some sense, a natural act of fortitude or courage of the most perfect kind. However, it's always more than that, because it's inspired at its heart by the orientations of faith, hope, and charity, which give what he calls, in a technical sense, scholastic technical sense, a new formal object, or you might say in a metaphorical sense, a new horizon to why we're doing all this. So instead of giving one's life on the field of battle in a Greek city-state, in the ancient Hellenistic context, you're dying in, you might say, the Colosseum, offering your life for God and for Christ as a witness to the truth of the supernatural faith. And in that sense, you're bringing testimony to others out of charity, out of love for them, but not a natural love, not a mere amicability of the city or a mere act of human justice, but inspired by a deeper supernatural love of God and of neighbor that's a gift of grace. So that's an interesting case where you might say he subverts the narrative of the Hellenistic Roman notion of cardinal virtue, or sublimates it, or reorients it towards a more ultimate religious horizon. Now, there's some interesting little things to note after that. One is that formal object can inspire us not just in the Colosseum and the face of martyrdom, but in the more ordinary life of Christian fortitude, because he thinks that the Christian does, in a certain sense, this is using a little bit of a Heideggerian language, but he does say, basically, in the treatise on fortitude, the Christian lives unto death, or lives in the face of death, and has to live his life or her life in a way such that reason does not allow the will, and the will does not allow, well, the will is fortified in such a way by the virtue of courage that it doesn't allow reason to become subjugated to fear as we pursue the authentic ultimate good, which is union with God in love, the service of neighbor for the sake of God, and the orientation of all our other virtues in view of those most ultimate goods. So you might say there's a kind of regulatory feature of Christian prudence, keeping everything oriented towards the ultimate horizon, and fortitude infused with the virtue of charity, infused with the virtues of faith and hope, move the Christian through the pursuit of natural goods, animated by a deep strength or habitual fortitude to stay the course, to live for the highest reality, and to let the love of God and of neighbors suffuse the exercise of all the civic and personal virtues to stabilize them from a higher domain above. That's to say, by grace. And so in some sense, he thinks then, even though not most people don't suffer martyrdom, there is a way in which a person can live in Christian fortitude inspired by charity in all of their life in order to live reasonably for God and for others without giving into either fear or despair, even in the face of human death and mortality, and remaining oriented toward eternal life, towards the pursuit of eternal life for oneself and others, and the pursuit of the good. The final thing to say about this is he does not think that you can act in the name of all this religious orientation against the natural goods of the city. In fact, he thinks you can still see the natural goods that need to be maintained, like justice towards all, affability, the prudent pursuit of the goods of the city, common life with others, whether they be Christian or non-Christian, and that the ordinary aims of fortitude can remain, and we can to some extent see them in people who are perhaps not recipients of grace. So I mean, you can have, just to take the classic example, you can have soldiers on the battlefield who are not religious, but they could exhibit fortitude defending their national country against an unjust aggressor. You could have people who show great fortitude running a corporation when they have a stressful and difficult situation. It's not the same, heroic fortitude of the soldier, but there's a certain kind of, courage or strength of character that's exhibited. These are not religious virtues, and they may be marred by imperfection and weakness, and people may rarely achieve some degree of them, but they have a certain natural structure. Christians can pursue many of these sort of natural forms of fortitude, and should seek to do so in an appropriate, reasonable way in the right natural circumstances, but they need to also always subjugate that pursuit to the deeper inner orientation and animation of doing all things for the love of God in Christ and the love of neighbor, animated by charity. So there's a kind of, you might say, deep respect for nature in Aquinas, but there's also even, you might say, deeper insistence on the harmony of nature and grace, and the capacity in the Christian life to challenge, and the invitation, but also the real possibility of subordinating all of one's natural aims and ends towards a more ultimate supernatural horizon, animated at heart by faith, hope, and charity, which he calls infused virtues that transform and elevate and can heal the frailties of our nature and help us, build up natural virtue like fortitude, interior to a higher religious form of life.
Okay, so I'll be addressing the virtue of courage in Islam, and I'd like to start with a quote by a man named Wahab ibn Munabbih, who was an early hadith collector, so an early collector of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he said, "Everything has two ends and a middle. If you hold one of the ends, the other will be skewed. If you hold the middle, the two ends will be balanced. So seek the middle ground in all things." So we'll see that this sort of prefigures and goes along with this idea of virtue being a sort of middle ground between two excesses, which of course is an ancient idea that is taken up in all three of the Abrahamic faiths in one way or another. So if we come specifically to Islamic textual sources and what they say about courage, we will start with the Quran, which for Muslims is regarded as the direct words of God himself as revealed to the Prophet Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. And so in the Quran itself, unlike words for some of the other virtues like wisdom, justice, and temperance, which we find in the Quran, and also patient forbearance and other virtuous traits, the common Arabic word for courage, which is shajara, does not appear in the Quran itself. However, if we consider the meaning of the virtue of courage to consist of something like, and I'm just taking from Merriam-Webster right now, we'll get to some other definitions later, but just to get the discussion going, if we consider courage to be something like mental or moral strength, to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty, this needs to be refined, then we find that the Quran indeed contains numerous verses that call for standing up boldly for truth and justice, remaining firm in the face of enemy hostility, and having the courage to fear no one or nothing but God through reliance on him alone. For example, the Quran reports that when the Prophet Muhammad's followers were warned in the context of a battle that their enemies had gathered against them, the Quran talks about those who, when it is said to them, the people have gathered against you, so fear them, this only increases them in faith, and they say, God suffices us. What an excellent guardian is he. In another chapter of the Quran, the believers are described as, quote, striving in the way of God, fearing not the blame of any blamer. While another verse reports that the devoted followers of past prophets, such as of Moses, of Abraham, of Noah, Jesus, all of the great prophets, they, quote, did not falter in the face of what befell them in the way of God, nor did they weaken, nor did they demean themselves, end of quote. And poignantly, in a moment of existential danger, when the Prophet's enemies were about to chance upon him and his close companion Abu Bakr, while the two sought refuge in a cave in the desert, the Prophet comforted his companion by calmly reassuring him to seek confidence in the protection of God. Fear not, he said, for verily God is with us. Finally, when inevitably confronting a foe on the field of combat, a time when courage is often literally a matter of life and death, the believers are instructed in the Quran to prove their mettle and not to shrink from fear or faintness of heart. Quote, again from the Quran, O you who believe, when you meet a company in battle, be firm and remember God much, that haply you may prosper. Followed up in the very next verse with the exhortation to, quote, be patient, for truly God is with the patient, end of quote. So the antithesis of courage, which is cowardice, is regarded as a moral vice that can, under some circumstances, lead to a drastically ignoble end. Again, we quote from the Quran, and whosoever turns his back to them, i.e. the enemy who's attacking that day, unless it be part of a stratagem of battle or to withdraw to another company, shall certainly earn the wrath of God, and his refuge shall be hell. What an evil journey's end. So these are some of the verses of the Quran that pertain to sort of embodiments of the virtue of courage, even if the word itself is not used. Now, if we turn from the Quran, which is to the words of the Prophet himself as collected in the Hadith literature, we find that there are a number of Hadith reports in which the Prophet actually explicitly addresses the virtue of courage. And one such report, he is reported to have said, let not fear of people prevent one of you from speaking the truth if he knows it. So this is the necessity of having truth in order to speak, the necessity of having courage in order to speak the truth. Along similar lines, the Prophet says in another hadith, quote, verily among the greatest acts of struggle or jihad is to speak a word of justice in the face of a tyrannical ruler. And indeed, this is the very kind of courage that God in the Quran enjoins upon Moses in the face of the tyranny of Pharaoh. So these hadith reports illustrate the necessity of courage for the establishment of both truth and also justice. So courage here underlies and is necessary for the establishment of some of the other cardinal virtues like truth and justice, and it must be done with wisdom. And we'll see how these come together a little later on. So noble is the virtue of courage that, according to the Prophet, quote, God loves courage even if only to kill a snake or scorpion. In another hadith we read, quote, there are two traits that God Most High loves, bounty and courage. And there are two traits that God Most High detests, miserliness and indecency. Finally, among the many supplications that the Prophet taught his followers is the following, O God, I seek refuge with thee from worry and grief, from incapacity and laziness, from cowardice and miserliness, and from being overwhelmed by debt or overpowered by other men. So in this application, the prophet teaches men and women to seek refuge in God from, among other things, cowardice, which is the antithesis of courage. So courage, like any other virtue, is only as good as its manifestation in concrete behavior and action. And because we as humans learn more by living example than by mere definitions and verbal exhortation, the Quran actually describes the Prophet Muhammad as being a moral exemplar and commands his followers, the believers in his message, to actually take him as a moral exemplar and follow his way. And the Prophet himself also said in another hadith report, verily I was sent only to perfect the noble traits of character. And he's considered by Muslims to be the kind of supreme human embodiment of the various virtues. And so Muslims look to his example in order to discover how to implement such virtues in practice. I don't want to go into specific details right now because of the time. But just to give a very brief idea, the Prophet's companion, Anas, stated that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was, quote, the best of people, the most generous of people, and the most courageous of people. And he proceeded to illustrate this last trait by means of an anecdote, which I won't get into now. But one of his other companions, Ibn Umar, said, quote, I never saw anyone more courageous, intrepid, magnanimous, and agreeable than the Messenger of God. And his cousin and son-in-law and close companion Ali, who himself was legendary for his heroic bravery and steadfastness, said, quote, when the battle grew fierce and pupils turned red, i.e. from the heat of war, we would seek protection with the Messenger of God, and none would be closer to the enemy than he. So this is all what we can call maybe outward or external courage. Courage in order to speak truth in the face of a tyrant, courage to face an enemy in the battlefield, and so forth. But there's another kind of courage, which is even greater and higher, which is the inner courage. And so in addition to these commonly, what we might think of as common iterations of the external courage that we talked about, slaying harmful beasts like snakes and scorpions and so on and so forth, the Islamic tradition also identifies an inwardly directed courage. This inner courage consists in facing down the most dangerous enemy of all, which is the human ego, and the passions and the whims of the lower self, or nafs in Arabic. In fact, the same word used for struggle against an enemy, an external enemy, jihad, which we already heard, which literally just means exerting effort, is also used to denote the struggle against the desires of the soul, which is then called jihad and nafs. So jihad against the nafs, or the lower desires and the whims and passions of the self. Of the two kinds of jihad, it is the inward struggle, the inner struggle that is of the greater moment. This is because the ultimate enemies of man, namely the craving of the nafs, the lower self, the prodding of Satan, and love for the allurement of this world, are relentless in their attacks against the children of Adam, i.e. us, human beings, and thus the struggle against them is, of necessity, unceasing. Furthermore, these adversaries threaten us not merely in our bodies and our outward forms, but in our moral character, our virtue, and our spiritual disposition, those qualities that ultimately define our inner reality, as well as the meaning and quality of our acts. And the Prophet is reported to have said, quote, verily, God does not look to your forms or your bodies, or in another narration of this hadith, he does not look to your forms or your wealth, but rather he looks to your hearts and your deeds. And an early commander, Muslim commander named Al-Battal, who died in the year 740 of the Common Era, is reported to have said that, quote, courage is patient forbearance for a time, and that is the jihad, or the struggle against the outward enemy. But, he continues, it is also, quote, jihad against the inward enemy, which is the struggle against the ego and the passions. For struggling against them is of the greatest forms of jihad, or struggle, end of quote. So those are from the textual sources of the Quran and the Hadith. And so if we move a little bit onto the Islamic tradition itself, we find that in the ethical treatise of the 9th century Baghdadi theologian, Al-Jahid, he wrote a treatise called The Refinement of Moral Character. He defines courage as, quote, embarking upon odious or dangerous matters when there's a need for it, guarding one's composure in moments of fear, and being undeterred by death, end of quote. And 2 centuries after him, the Andalusian scholar, theologian, and literary figure Ibn Hazm, who died in the year 1064, Common Era, in his book, Moral Character and Behavior, defined courageousness as the willingness, quote, to give up one's life for the defense of religion, family, an oppressed neighbor, or a wronged person appealing for aid, to redress an injustice committed against a person's wealth, and for the sake of honor and pursuing all other means of establishing justice and truth, regardless whether those opposing one be many or few, end of quote. And so in the remainder of the time that is left to me, I would like to look a little bit more closely at the treatment of courage by one of the greatest figures in Islamic history, which is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who dies in the year 1111 of the Common Era. He is one of the most celebrated figures of Islamic law, theology, and spirituality. And when in one of his books called The Balance of Action, al-Ghazali follows the famous Muslim philosopher Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as known in the West, and endorses a Platonic identification of four cardinal virtues: temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice. However, unlike in the Greek tradition, courage, like the other virtues, yields not simply to the dictates of the intellect, simpliciter, but, quote, to quote al-Ghazali, the intellect that has been disciplined by revelation or the revealed law, ash-shara, concerning that upon which it embarks and refrains. Furthermore, given the challenge of the task to realize the virtue of courage or any of the virtues, it is only through God's enabling grace or tawfiq that we can reach, let alone maintain, any virtue at all. And finally, the goal of virtue, any of the virtues, for al-Ghazali and the Islamic tradition as a whole, is not merely to achieve eudaimonia in this life, as for Aristotle, but to attain the otherworldly bliss of paradise in the everlasting presence of God. Classical Islamic discussions, not only of courage, but indeed of the virtues in general, as represented here in the work of al-Ghazali, thus depart from Greek parallels by grounding the virtues in the light of revelation, turning the acquisition of virtue into a form of worship, and locating the true telos of virtuous conduct in the abiding realm of the hereafter. And so if I can quickly quote from al-Ghazali here, he speaks of courage as, quote, an excellent and praiseworthy trait. And then he continues, quote, whoever possesses this quality, i.e. of courage, should preserve it by diligently persisting in the practice of the corresponding actions. Whoever does not possess it should consider his state. If his nature inclines towards the deficiency that constitutes cowardice, then he should engage in the actions of the courageous, forcing himself to perform them consistently such that he becomes accustomed to it, i.e. courage, as a natural quality and a fixed disposition. But if he inclines to the side of excess, which is recklessness, then he should acquaint himself with the consequences of things and take full measure of their danger, then force himself to refrain from them so as to reach the point of moderation or something close to it, for reaching the point of moderation is exceedingly difficult. And this prescription mirrors one of the prescriptions of the Prophet himself, who in a well-known hadith says, knowledge is acquired by learning. In other words, well, in Arabic, al-ilm bit-ta'allum wal-hilm bit-tahallum. So knowledge is acquired by actively seeking out and learning it, slowly but surely. And clemency is acquired by performing clement acts. In other words, habituating oneself to the virtue by performing the corresponding actions in a consistent manner. And then the difficulty of achieving any moral virtue lies in the fact that, again, to quote al-Ghazali, quote, seeking the mean between these extremes is something very arduous, finer than a hair and sharper than the blade of a sword, end of quote. This is why al-Ghazali tells us God has made it obligatory in every cycle of prayer, the 5 daily prayers of Muslims, to read Surah Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, which contains in it the supplication, guide us to the straight path. For, according to al-Ghazali, quote, there is no escaping these forbidden matters except through God's enabling grace and his mercy. So I think I will stop there, and we can talk maybe in our discussion about the virtue of courage today and how we can benefit from this virtue in our current circumstances, but I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I'm going to. Those were fascinating presentations. Thank you all for that very rich sort of fire hose of knowledge and insight and information. A lot to unpack in all of that. I am going to go ahead and open up with an interesting observation, and I want you to tell me if I'm crazy or not. And that observation is that, I saw, Alan, when you were discussing Deuteronomy, I went and looked at it, and I found it to be very interesting, as you mentioned, that in fact, and this is something I would not have noticed if you hadn't had pointed it out, that there is no, that the discussion of courage is really rather indirect, as you say. I mean, it's like, don't be afraid, don't be a coward, essentially, rely on God. But there's no direct mention of courage. It's not that courage is not there. I mean, certainly it's there, but it's just not being directly referred to. And then Carl Sharif as well, you mentioned, and I think just by way of just a matter of fact, but I find some significance perhaps in the fact that also in the Quran, courage is not mentioned by name. Even though, okay, Muslims believe that the Bible contains original revelation, but it also has some additions or subtractions from human beings. Nevertheless, we certainly believe in the truth that is in it, and we also, it's also the fact that certainly it reflects a very strong, let's say like Semitic. I don't know if that's the correct word, but Semitic sort of, or let's say like a revelatory, perhaps, theme, and that is not mentioning courage directly. I wonder if there's some significance there, Carl Sharif, in the Quran's not mentioning it, that resonates with it not being mentioned in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And I want to mention something else too. You mentioned the hadith of Anas, where Anas describes the Prophet as ashja' nas, the most brave, courageous of men. And yet I don't find, and I haven't done a study of all the hadith, but I did some searching in some databases. I did find the Prophet himself actually, you mentioned the hadith, but I don't think he actually mentions the word shuja', does he? I found one place, and there could be many more, of course. There are hundreds of thousands of hadith, but I found a hadith where, and this is a famous hadith where someone asked the Prophet, the person who is which of the three, there are three people who fight in battle. Which of them fights for the sake of God? And he mentions three: one who fights for the sake of showing off, and another, and I forget the third one. And then he says one of them who fights for courage, shuja', to demonstrate his shuja', his courage. And the Prophet said it's the one who fights to raise God's word high. Even there, he doesn't acknowledge shuja', even as a good. Now, I don't mean to say that shuja', courage, is not a good thing in any of these traditions. I just mean to say that I find it interesting that courage is sort of not really. Not that it's not a thing, not that it's not recognized, but that perhaps the avoidance of mentioning it by name. Would you guys, and Carl Sharif, you start, would you say that it's possible that the avoidance of naming this virtue is to de-emphasize the ego and to reorient the actual aim of courage? To God, in other words, to God, towards God's pleasure, instead of the sort of, say like ancient Greek type of, or even the ancient Arab. That was the other thing I was going to say. The ancient Arab pre-Islamic attitude of courage as being kind of like the, really the defining virtue apart from generosity, in the same way that it was with the Greeks.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. I mean, the hadith that I did quote, I don't have the Arabic in front of me, but the hadith about killing the snake or the scorpion is precisely God loves courage, even if only to kill a snake or a scorpion. So I believe that the word is actually used there in that one. In terms of the hadith that you mentioned about the three people who were brought, which one of them was really fighting for the right cause, you mentioned not just courage, but the one who was fighting in order to show his courage. In other words, the courage was being manifested as a form of vainglory.
Yes.
right? And the person wants to be known. And of course, there's the other famous hadith, among the first 3 people who will be thrown into hell. One of them is actually a religious scholar, right? All this knowledge and learning, but he will be asked, why did you learn? And the person will say, I learned for your sake and to make your word highest. And God will say, you lied. You learned and became a scholar so people could say so-and-so was a scholar, and it has been said, right? So your intention was for your own ego. Your ego has been gratified by people acclaiming you in the world, off to the hellfire. And the next person is someone who also, is killed in the battlefield and said, I fought, to make God's word uppermost and so forth. And God says, you lied. You've lied. You've only fought in order that it be said that you were a brave man or a soldier, or, fought valiantly, and it was said, off to the hellfire, right? So I think in all of these cases, even acquiring religious knowledge, of course, there's another narration of this hadith in which someone who recites the Quran beautifully, learns the Quran, recites it, and so on and so forth, is also ends up in the hellfire because he did it not really for the sake of God and for upholding truth and so on and so forth, but for his own ego. So I think courage definitely can fall into that. There can be a sort of bravado, a sort of machismo, a sort of look at me, I'm this hero. But I don't think that is specific to courage. I think there are other virtuous actions that can be the case with as well. And as we know, like someone could even spend generously in charity. Poor people have eaten, the mosque has been built or whatever, but if the person did it for the sake of his ego or to be kind of acclaimed by others, then we know that deed would have very little weight with God in terms of the moral quality of it for that person on the day of judgment, right? Even though benefit was had from the deed, but because of the hadith that actions are but by intention, and each person reaps that which he intends, any of these good actions, if it's done with the wrong intention, would actually redound, with negative consequences upon the agent.
But, and I'm going to turn to Alan, but it just seems to me like, for example, hikmah, wisdom, is specifically mentioned, obviously, in the Quran, and there are other virtues that are mentioned specifically. It just seems to me really interesting that in all the obvious places of the discussion of what is actually really courage, that courage is not mentioned by name in the Quran, and very, very rarely in the Hadith, except to perhaps distinguish it from, as you mentioned, to kind of, I don't know, kind of like say, well, wait a minute, let's just make sure that it's not a kind of vainglory. Alan, am I kind of hallucinating here, or have the commentators on the Old Testament noticed something about this absence of, I think you were kind of getting at that. I mean, the absence of the mention of courage directly.
I think courage is so absent that people have not really noticed its absence. I'll give you an example from a passage in the Talmud about David as a warrior, showing courage, and how that's reinterpreted by the Talmud. So here's the quote: David was blessed with 6 virtues, as it was written. And here's a quote from first book of Samuel, chapter 16, verse 18. And one of the servants answered and said, behold, I have seen a son of Yishai of the house of Bethlehem, who knows how to play, an instrument, and is a fine warrior and a man of war, and prudent in speech, and a beautiful man, and the Lord is with him. So then the Talmud glosses this. Who knows how to play means that he knows how to ask complex and germane questions about Torah matters. A fine warrior means that he knows how to answer questions raised with regard to matters of Torah. A man of war means that he knows how to negotiate his way in the battle to understand the Torah. A beautiful man is one who displays understanding in facets of halakha, Jewish law, and explains it well. And prudent in speech, davar, means that he infers one matter, davar, from another matter. And the Lord is with him means that the halakha, the law, is ruled in accordance with his opinion in every area of halakha. So you have this, basically an outlaw, a brigand, the young David, who in the rabbinic view becomes a rabbinic sage. They rabbinize him, and all of his martial qualities and his, just the sheer force of character that he has that gets him through this dangerous life that he has to live. It's all turned into some sort of acuity and hermeneutics and understanding the subtleties of texts as rabbis read them. So I think there's this kind of massive shift that Judaism manifests of a turn away from one kind of life and one kind of religiosity to something very different. It reminds me somewhat of Alistair MacIntyre, who in his early book, A Short History of Ethics, talks about how Greek ethics as a reflective enterprise gets started by thinking about the Homeric hero. And the figure presented in the Iliad, the Odyssey, those figures, however great they are in literature, they're completely dysfunctional in a polis in the 5th century. So you have to think about how that inherited tradition of courage and other virtues actually plays in an urban setting in a much more literate culture. I think something like that is going on with the development of Judaism from the Bible into the rabbinic oral Torah. But I think because the Bible is in some ways a product of its canonization by the rabbis, you already have that kind of beginning to take hold in the Bible itself.
That's a fascinating point. Father Thomas Joseph, is there anything that kind of you would because I'm looking through Aquinas's discussion of courage and fortitude, and he refers a lot to Aquinas and Ambrose, so he's being informed by them, but and of course the Bible, the text of the Bible itself. Is there anything in what Carl Sharif and Alan said that kind of made you think about what Aquinas' take on courage is?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's some important overlaps between the three traditions as we're hearing them exposited. I would probably, in the form of Christian tradition I refer to as more normative, want to push back in defense of the essential nature of necessity of fortitude or some degree of courage as a normative part of human existence, independently to some extent, or at least logically distinguishable from people's ultimate adherence to divine revelation, although I think it's hard to get it really right in the depths without that. So let me just say a couple things. First of all, St. Augustine says very helpfully that pride is unlike all the other vices because it's a vice that can prey off the limited acquisition of the virtues. So as in the cases that Carl was underscoring, intellectual virtue, the virtue of fortitude, if they aren't really animated by genuine charity, love of God for God's own sake, then they can actually be oriented ultimately towards love of self as in a primary and unmeasured way, which is, of course, pertains to the vice of pride as unmeasured love. And I think Aquinas follows Augustine in thinking if charity as a grace doesn't transform the heart to love God for his own sake, then there will be some kind of what he calls the primacy of the private good of the love of self that takes precedence even in the acquisition of the other virtues, the natural virtues. And so they'll begin to be preened or cultivated in view of in self-referential ways, right? So you've got a way that grace needs to come in and heal and orient these virtues towards their ultimate end. The second thing that's an overlap with what Alan was saying is that with regards to the acquisition of the virtue of fortitude, I think Aquinas, like other fathers of the church from the 4th century, at the time that the Talmud's being compiled, I'm thinking of people like Origen and Ambrose, they will interiorize the notion of spiritual battle in the Old Testament to refer primarily to the battle of submission of the body to the soul and the soul to God. And of course, this can have effects in how we actually live in the external world. But the idea of fortitude is, interiorized in Aquinas primarily in view of an acquisition of interior integrity, of submitting things truly to the will to the reason, and reason to God, so that there's a kind of interior order of the self that's religious under grace. And so I think there's deep parallels there. That all being said, I think fortitude is in Aquinas's vision, a kind of essential dimension of the human person in the way we regulate the passions. We are going to be subject to excessive or problematic fears, angers. Despair is a temptation for every human being in the face of death, in the face of the loss of human goods, threats that are external or internal that menace us. And we have to regulate those irascible passions and fortify ourselves to live in a conduct in accord with the pursuit of the truth that's stable and enduring in ways that we can try to serenely maintain means in view of ends. And I think it's hard for people to do that, but I think they can't achieve even very fundamental goods that they're committed to, like the pursuit of degrees or the pursuit of vocation in terms of work, or certainly fidelity to God and to spouses or to religious forms of life they undertake, without a certain amount of interior fortitude. So I think there's a theistic vision of fortitude that saves some of the radical core of the earlier religious or Hellenistic vision, but sanates it and purifies it, but still preserves its kind of rational features. This is not a highly polemical point, obviously. I'm agreeing with the spirit of much of what was said, but simply indicating that I think there is a sort of natural philosophical core of reasoning in the Christian monotheistic tradition about the essential goodness of natural fortitude, you might say rethought on Christian soil as a natural good, independently of the fact that we do actually believe that, normally that needs to be lived out concretely in subordination to the love of God, by grace.
That's yeah. I was just reading here what Ambrose says. Fortitude is not lacking in courage, for alone she defends the honor of the virtues and guards their behests. She it is that wages an inexorable war on all vice, undeterred by toil, brave in face of dangers, steeled against pleasures, unyielding to lusts, avoiding covetousness as a deformity that weakens virtue. And I actually, this brings to mind what Nietzsche would say about this, and he would say, "Oh, this is just really the almost like essential example of what he would call slave morality, and how the Judeo-Christian but that's a tricky term, but the Jewish and Christian morality valorizes and sublimates weakness, that this is a morality that is sort of like I guess kind of betraying the pagan, the natural pagan virtues and so on, that he would wish human beings would adapt. Can we? I've talked about in the virtue on the section on humility. We just discussed about the ways in which Nietzsche was wrong. Would someone like to offer why they think that Nietzsche is wrong? That this is a kind of, in fact, slave morality to turn the virtue of courage into an internal, turn it internally, and of course, the three faiths also have a martial version of this as well. But why is Nietzsche wrong in this? Why is it wrong to see this as something that is a kind of weakness?
If you all don't mind, I'll take a shot at that.
Please.
Look, I think there's a lot of ways to handle Nietzsche, at least among Christians, and they don't agree about this. There's different ways to see it. My own view is that what Nietzsche takes to be beautiful and noble in the Greco-Roman past is partly related to what Christians would consider vices of self-creation, self-importance, that he wants to reclaim as forms of artistic creativity and splendor. And that's a real question about what human flourishing consists in based on what a human being is, and metaphysical questions about the explanation of reality in light of the existence of God, the transcendent creator, or the absence of that kind of metaphysics. That being said, I think there is some exaggeration about this very point, because in the monotheistic traditions, and I would speak most about my own, in Christian tradition, the notion of splendor, beauty, and human glory is very profound. And of course, it's a glory reconfigured around Christ. It's a glory reconfigured around, we think, of course, God's own humanity, God being human in Christ, but also the glory of the human person made in the image of God, the glory of transformative grace in the life of the saints, and the ways that that can be depicted in visual and artistic and poetic culture. So the idea that the Greco-Roman world has a kind of a monopoly on glory or nobility or splendor or beauty seems to me a question of the, I would say, highest disputability. Others, though, would say that Nietzsche has understood the right division but taken the wrong side, and that the revaluation of values enacted by Judaism that he takes issue with, and I do think he takes issue with Judaism as much or more than with Christianity, which rightly, because he sees that Judaism's ethics is at the heart of Christianity, and I take that as an anti-Semitic point. That's a value that Nietzsche gives us, even though I think he's anti-Judaic in an intensive way. This, Judaic core of the Western tradition he takes issue with, that's in Christianity, did reevaluate values in some important ways, and I think that is worth considering. Some would say you have to kind of take Christianity against Nietzsche and therefore also against the Greco-Roman heritage. And I think that's too strong a standpoint, but it is a standpoint that you find in some elements of Lutheranism and in Catholic Jansenism, the idea that the whole treatment of the moral life as virtue is itself an error, which is a view I don't think anyone here takes, but which is a view that's very common among many Protestants today, that even virtue theory is a Hellenistic idea of a self-production culture, an idea of creating yourself into something great that we take from a pagan culture that's not in the Bible. And I take issue with that. I don't hold that view. That's a Christian theology I think is extreme. But I'm just saying that there's interesting provocations from Nietzsche that invite us to find a variety of responses. I would want to argue the Christian notion of virtue, rightly oriented, dignifies the human being, and the kinds of virtues that Nietzsche wants to laud, in some sense, I think are ignoble, even though his rhetorical and aesthetic style displaying them is often trenchant and magnificent. But I think it's a false allurement.
I think
anyone, Alan?
Yeah, I think Nietzsche's right about something and wrong about something. I think what he's right about is that if God is dead, the morality that's been built up over centuries is dead too. And once you take the fundamental theism away from the Western morality, the morality collapses. It may not have collapsed yet, but it's going to collapse. I think that's basically right. I think where he goes wrong in thinking that God is dead and that we've killed him. We've done our best, but I don't think that God is dead. I think the fact that we're here having this serious discussion means that it remains plausible, credible, and perhaps virtuous for serious thinkers in the early 21st century to continue to align themselves with ancient traditions and to be devoted to them and to find the ways in which they're not defeated by Nietzsche's vision of liberative nihilism. For me, the way the more critical thinker, because he's somewhat more in-house, is Spinoza. And Spinoza also has this strong critique of Judaism. From my point of view, quite a bit more hateful than Nietzsche's critique. I think Nietzsche is anti-Judaic, but I don't think Nietzsche is an anti-Semite. I mean, he says some weirdly positive things about the Jews. He just thinks Judaism is the apotheosis of everything that's rotten. A fine distinction. But Spinoza, he sets off this theme that that Jews are cowards, that Judaism is a religion that systematically depreciates, diminishes, and undermines manliness, as he puts it. And his language is that Judaism makes the spirit of the Jews effeminate. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin that I have in front of me. And that has been taken to heart by generations of Jews. So in effect, the valorization of martial courage, particularly in the Zionist project, and the poetry and the ballet leading up to the Zionist movement in modernity, that's all a response to say, yes, Spinoza's right, but we're going to prove him wrong. And some of it comes from a response to Nietzsche too. I mean, you do have literary figures in the late 19th, early 20th century among the Jews writing in Hebrew and in Yiddish who are responding to Nietzsche as well. It's a dynamic field.
It would be really interesting to read what some of the Jewish, to read some of the Jewish responses to Nietzsche within the thinkers. I don't think any of that has been translated into English as far as I've been aware, but I'm not an expert. Would sure love to see some of that. I wanted to, okay. Now, this raises an interesting point because to me, the survival of the Jewish people is through the, first of all, the destruction of their polity, correct my history, but I believe it was the Southern Kingdom and then Judah. Which one of those was destroyed first? And which
the Northern Kingdom was destroyed first. And the Southern Kingdom a couple hundred years later.
Okay, so there's that, and then the diaspora, and to survive itself is obviously an act of incredible courage, both individually and collectively. And to a certain extent, I mean, courage is needed for ordinary individuals to even just roll out of bed in the morning. I mean, many of us face, there are people like people with debilitating diseases and chronic pain. I mean, all of us have challenges that have been placed upon us. There's a hadith where the Prophet said, I'm paraphrasing, he said the people who were tested the most are the prophets, and then the righteous people, and so there are people who who are tested in myriad ways in their lives and with ways that we're not even aware of. There are people going through their daily lives. And Carl Sharif, can you give us some thoughts on the way that courage is sort of, at least that Islam teaches Muslims, and teaches people to be courageous in different ways in their lives that aren't merely like, in martial ways or even in the ways that have been discussed here, the ways of like sort of cultivating the soul to be virtuous. I mean, what other ways does courage manifest, and is it necessary?
Well, I think obviously in the two that you mentioned, and then also other things that I mentioned, is standing up for truth, standing up for justice, being able to speak. It's, we think that it's easy to speak. It's not at all easy to speak, sometimes, right? Because there can be so many consequences. And also in the face of any type of hardship, I would say. You mentioned things like debilitating disease, right? So much, going back to the hadith I mentioned earlier, that إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are but by intention, and each person sort of sows what he intends. Someone comes down with cancer or some type of other disease, a lot of the kind of state of a person's soul is reflected in the way a person would react to something like that. Some people will react with utter despair. Other people will react with precisely as Alan was saying in the beginning, reliance on and trust in God, which are very highly supreme virtues in Islam, right? This tawakkul ala Allah, to put one's trust in God, to know that everything is in the hands of God. And so, there's a hadith in which the Prophet says that patience, right, as-sabr, which is also one of the cardinal virtues, is patience, is عند الصدمة الأولى, that patience is to be manifested when at the beginning of when the shock first hits you, so to speak. You first receive the terrible news, right? That is the moment in which you have to have that sort of fortitude and the patience and the trust in God to kind of take it with faith, and to take it with the assurance that the ultimate result of all things is in God's hand, and so forth, and to have that sort of resignation to the divine will and the divine command. And I think all of that takes, in a sense, I don't want to expand courage so that everything is, a manifestation of courage, right? So then it means nothing. If it means everything, it means nothing. But I think that it does take courage to kind of face one's hardships, to face one's destiny, and to do so with conviction, and to do so with resolve, and to do so with what's the word I just used? Resignation in trust of the divine will, and reliance on God's power, and also belief in God's wisdom. I think all of those kind of draw upon the same resources that are watered by this virtue of courage, which we're meant to cultivate.
Actually, this brings us to the very next point, which are those, let's say, those virtues that are, I don't know, subordinate to or spring out of or are related to courage. You mentioned patience. Patience is not one of the cardinal virtues as traditionally kind of like classified, the four, but it's certainly, and it's been a while since I read what Ghazali said about this, but patience is certainly derived from, in Islam, patience is it's probably, I don't know how many hundreds of times it's mentioned in the Quran. This is a major, how does, and then Alan, you mentioned trust in God. So and also in Arabic, tawakkul is mentioned throughout the Quran repeatedly. And again, it's interesting to me that patience, reliance on God, trust in God, are mentioned repeatedly, but courage by its name is not. Could someone, maybe Father Thomas Joseph, could you talk about how patience, reliance on God, or other virtues that are kind of spin off of or related to courage in the Christian tradition, and how are those things related?
Yeah, I can respond to those quickly, because obviously there's other people than Aquinas, but it's helpful to just have him as a reference. So when he, in the Summa, when he treats the three overarching infused virtues, faith, hope, and charity, hope sanctifies the human will in such a way, in the light of faith, that we entrust ourselves to God. So when we talk about trust, at least in the Thomistic tradition, we mean a kind of hope-filled, faithful reliance on God. That trusting in God is a matter of faith animated by hope. And hope that also then regulates the will in the face, or helps the will regulate the passions in the face of fear and despair as temptations, so that we can maintain the ardor of hope and trustfulness in God, reliance on God in faith. Okay, so that's very similar to some of the things we've been hearing. And then patience comes out of patience comes out of temperance, of fortitude or courage, as the subjacent dimension of that virtue. He calls it a distinct virtue that's under the heading of the larger general virtue of temperance. He says it's necessary to have a virtue to safeguard the good of reason against sorrow, lest reason give way to sorrow, and this patience does. This is like patience in the face of bad news, or of a trial of something that has to be endured. And so patience is a kind of instantiation of temperance, and temperance is subordinate to hope, and hope is an animating factor in faith by which we trust in God and reliance on him. All right, so these are just sort of similar observations. This has to do with the way that the infused virtues of faith and hope come down and transform our capacity for fortitude and patience so that they become genuinely religious in orientation and open to sharing in the life of God or in communion with God.
When we were discussing the virtue of wisdom, and this will probably come up when we discuss justice, we discussed a lot about that panel. We discussed a lot about the relationship between law and virtue. It sounds here as if, I mean, here the distinction becomes far more clear when we're talking about courage and we're talking about patience and hope and all the beautiful virtues of the soul that are related to it. It becomes very clear what the role of law is versus the role of, let's say, like character qualities, seem to be, this really highlights. And I just mentioned that for the students who are listening. Here we can begin to say, because it's not immediately obvious when we talk about virtues, how that's different from, say, laws like thou shalt not steal, or even laws like, want for your neighbor what you want for yourself. These are kind of rules which we can see now how internal states are related, but are in fact independent to some degree. If anyone wants to pick up on that, they certainly can. But you mentioned something, Sharif, you mentioned something about intentions. Alan, so let's pick up on intention, okay? With all of the virtues, really, and this is one of the defining characteristics of virtue ethics. Intention is of paramount importance. So, for example, I can look like I'm being generous outwardly, but in fact, I could be inwardly seeking seeking fame. Definitely, we already mentioned in the Hadith and the saying of the Prophet about the person who is, pretending, or outwardly he's seeking fame, but his outward acts look the same. In fact, there's another Hadith where the Prophet came and said that about a person who had died on the battlefield, a Muslim. He said this person's in hell. Someone said, well, he was fighting for for the sake of God. And then Carl Sharif, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he said this is I think there are a couple of instances like that, but one of them, it was the guy had killed himself because he had suffered an injury, and he leaned on a sword and died. And he said no, because there he didn't have patience. But there's another one, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's a different point, because I mean, the idea here is that suicide is prohibited, right? And he goes to the hellfire for having committed suicide rather than enduring the pain that he was suffering after the battle. But sure. Yes, that it is a lack of that kind of sabr, which is this patient endurance, right? Yeah. And then what about the other one where the Prophet said, no, he's someone who was fighting for, I don't know, for showing off or something. That's another hadith. Or am I conflating? I don't recall that one. I think you're conflating with the first hadith we mentioned about, the first three people who are, thrown into the hellfire on the day. All right. Yeah. But Alan, on a related point, so related to intention, you mentioned the evil person. So can an evil, an evil person obviously can't be wise, because they can be clever, they can be crafty, but they can't be wise. An evil person can't be, generous, because their generosity is motivated by their evil. An evil person can't be just unless they're doing it for some, again, worldly reasons, crafty reasons, for self-advancement. But can an evil person be courageous? Can an evil person, because what if you've got an evil person who's fighting for a cause of evil, and yet they're showing just magnificent selflessness and so on the battlefields. Or let's take an evil person in a non-martial situation. Can courage? Can we admire courage in a person who's fighting for evil or motivated by evil? Is that courage, or is that not courage at all? Does it call it something else?
I mean, I think you have to distinguish. You have to say that in one sense, the intention of the ultimate end does affect the very object and form of the virtue. So if the intention is love of self in a disordered sense, or the intention is some kind of, I don't know, inappropriate political nationalism, or unjust martial endeavor, then there's a way in which the intention definitely in some way specifies and therefore essentially shapes the act of courage. And insofar as it does that, it causes it to be something different from a virtue, meaning an act or a set of acts habitually posed in view of the just and right flourishing of the human being in concord with others for the common good. So it just depends how you define virtue. But if you define it rightly, I think it's very clear that a virtue that's aimed at a bad intention is only a virtue of semblance rather than an essentially correctly poised virtue. But that just pushes back the question of whether you can really have a virtue ethics without having a broader, you might say, politics of the common good, and indeed I would say an anthropology and a metaphysics of what human beings are really meant to be doing with themselves. That's why I think you do need wisdom as an architectonic intellectual virtue overriding the conduct. Now, on the other side, if you have a deformed understanding and you have what could be called elements of the vice of folly, which is the opposite of wisdom, meaning disorientation in life, and you're pursuing, let's just say, the nationalistic agenda of some group, that's not really well regulated by wisdom, a war of aggression against a less powerful country that you want to occupy for the sake of some national mythology, that's ill-begotten, and badly conducted, and but the problem is that nature it's simply eradicated. So you have something like natural love of the country, natural love of the family, natural solidarity with one's larger military company, natural desire to evade being killed and to conduct one's work with a kind of relative integrity. And so there's plenty of formal goods involved, and there's the habitual pursuit of those goods. So you're going to see something that looks like courage, and you might see something like the habitual capacity to do something, you might say, willfully brave or temperate in the face of the danger of death, but it's not rightly ordered in the larger architecture of the set of goods that need to be pursued. And so, there's elements of bravery, but there isn't the integral essence or species of courage, because it isn't set within the deeper framework of the pursuit of the good and of happiness in the just and right, and I would say, of course, also religious way. So but look, if you go too far one direction, you can end up with what I would call a problematic doctrine of radical depravity, where you're just going to have to say that anyone who doesn't have the ultimate right religious orientation is doing something depraved in everything they do. But it's not so simple. I mean, a lot of the good of nature remains in us, even when we're disoriented existentially about our ultimate horizon. And a lot of what people do in daily life can imply a certain semblance of fortitude and an imperfect acquisition of virtue, but it doesn't have all the formal specificity of perfection of virtue, because it lacks the right intention to the ultimate end, and it lacks wisdom. So it's a kind of middle position I would take on that.
Thank you for that, Alan. I wanted to ask you. We talk about Father Thomas Joseph talked about the ultimate end of the human being. What is the ultimate end of the human being, and how does courage relate to that?
If you look at an Aristotelian like Maimonides, there's definitely a sense that there's an ultimate end. It's rather the same ultimate end that Spinoza comes to, because he's Maimonidean in many ways, and that is a sort of intellectual love of God that's played out in how you live, in your ethics. But if you look at other Jewish sources that aren't so wrapped up in Greek ways of thinking, the question about what is the ultimate end, I don't think is the right question. A philosopher in the Islamic world that I'm kind of fond of, Saadi Gaon, he's really a pluralist about ends. I mean, he sees sort of an irreducibly diverse basket of goods that human beings pursue, and they need to be held in some kind of equilibrium, but you can't say that one of them is, more definitive than the other. I just want to say something about what Father Thomas Joseph just said, if that's okay. I think that's just a really lucid and helpful kind of overview of the metaethical issues here about virtue. And I somehow want to, I feel very torn on this. On the one hand, the sort of metaphysical background or framework in which both Father Thomas Joseph and Thomas Aquinas develop the virtues is very compelling. I mean, I do think you need something like that to make ultimate sense of the value of virtue. On the other hand, that strikes me as sort of wildly prescriptive and exclusive. And that problem of ascribing depravity to something that falls short of that level of integration and kind of metaphysical backstory, that's disturbing to me. I simply cannot see, like the example I always think of is my father was a soldier in World War II. He didn't land on D-Day, he landed a couple of days after, but I'm sure as he was coming off those boats, going up into Normandy, he was hoping that he wouldn't get his head blown off. And I'm pretty sure the German soldiers who were retreating were hoping they were not going to get their heads blown off either. And I don't see from a straight out descriptive point of view why you can't adequately describe both of those instances as hope. And I don't think one hope is any more virtuous or than the other. I don't think one hope is any more depraved than the other. If you're talking about evil people, perhaps I'm misled with that somewhat rhetorical instance. But if you're talking about ordinary people who are caught up in evil causes, which could be any of us, I think it all gets very complicated. I mean, I have a very good German friend whose father was a soldier. He was not a Nazi, he was a German soldier. And I'm sure he was full of hope too. And he hoped for things like, his family being safe and that he'd be able to return to them and live a normal life. I don't see any reason to depreciate the virtue of that in a sense.
So just to be clear, I was arguing against radical depravity, right? So
right.
I was agreeing that these are complicated cases because I wouldn't call a person fighting in the German army in 1943 that he's obviously fighting for an illegitimate cause, but he could be caught up in it for relatively, you might say, natural political reasons that sweep him up into it, where he's just a person in the middle of things trying to exhibit fairly normal human responses, like the hope of avoiding death, the hope of avoiding political execution by his own regime, and the hope of survival. And he finds himself in battle and he has to exhibit some degrees of courage. We wouldn't call him an ethically noble or exemplary person, but there's a kind of, I mean, when I talk about the intention, I mean, there is the ultimate end of union with God, but I think there's also more intermediate ends. And I think you can have a relative degree of virtue in relation to those degrees of ends, like trying to keep people in your unit alive. You could have a soldier who's a nurse, for example, who's a non-combatant who bravely tries to keep their soldiers alive, even though they're in the midst of an unjust war. And there could actually be legitimate acts of courage there that are kind of less problematic to identify, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Now, I wasn't describing the moral depravity thesis to you. You had pointed it out as a danger, but I think we get a slippery slope toward that if we're not careful. But you're very careful.
Well, if I could make it even slipperier, and take us to the edge of it. I mean, what I think one potential, because to me this is one of these things where if you try to go one direction, you end up ascribing courage to, like, say, evil people. I mean, again, like, with ISIS was very courageous. I mean, I've actually seen videos of these people that were, I mean, you would have to look at these people and say, hey, that's a pretty brave thing. This guy is climbing up on top of a tank by himself to drop a grenade into into this Iraqi tank. But at the same time, this ISIS, I'm fairly convinced, convinced is the personification of evil on the earth.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the second coming of the Nazis. They just weren't as successful, quote unquote, in their but they are truly the personification of evil on the earth, in the same way that and we've seen the Mongols, and we've seen this in many other times. But speaking of the Mongols, if anyone's seen the movie Mongol, I mean, this Genghis Khan was a extraordinarily brave, person. Now, for that matter, we could say that our own, for example, as a Muslim, I could say, I could say, well, my people, my co-religionists who are fighting for the truth are by definition the only people who are actually courageous, because they're on the truth. And those who are fighting for, say, like, I don't know, like in the Crusades or whoever they might have been fighting, whatever, those people were by definition could not have been courageous because they were fighting for falsehood. And yet that doesn't seem right. But at the same time, and Joseph Pieper discusses this, and I can't recall what exactly he said, but it was really brilliant. Maybe I'll put that as a suggested reading for the students to try to help us resolve. And how about this? The final essay project will be for them to resolve this paradox for us. Anyone have anything else that they want to throw in on this question?
If I can just jump in. So
Yeah.
I think, we've identified here several things about courage, which is one, that unlike something like wisdom, which is kind of self-justifying, self-explanatory, you can never have too much wisdom. I mean, wisdom can't go wrong as a virtue, right? Just by definition of what it is. To be wise is to be wise. Courage, I think, is of a different order, in the sense that we've said that a person can exhibit courage in sort of just the objective sense of standing up in front of danger and not really being too concerned about the consequences, right? But in my own presentation, when I began, I had defined from the text themselves courage as the ability to stand up and face danger for the sake of truth and justice, right? So it is a virtue that, in order to fully come into its own, has to be conditioned against other virtues, right? Otherwise, we would not be inclined to call such a person courageous, or if we did, then courage just wouldn't really be a virtue in that. I mean, person could be like mechanically courageous or courageous in a mundane sense without that necessarily being a virtue. And I think strength is the same. I mean, is strength good or bad? Well, there's actually a hadith where the Prophet, as you know, says, the strong believer is better and more beloved to God than the weak believer, but there's good in both of them. But the strong believer is better. So strong, that can mean physically strong in faith. It can be strong on different levels, but strength is good, but it's only good if it's, ultimately good if it's directed towards right ends. Otherwise, strength, of course, can be very destructive, right? Intelligence, the same. Intelligence can be incredibly destructive if it's turned towards the wrong end. We could say, in fact, the Nazis, and so were very intelligent, mechanical, able to this kind of, what's it called? I have the German Zweckrationalität. What is that?
What was it?
Zweckrationalität, like when you have
Zweckrationalität.
Yeah. What is that?
It's instrumental rationality.
For pragmatic ends. What was it?
Well, it's rationality toward an end.
Yeah,
I
towards
think it
this.
means merely instrumental
Yeah,
rationality,
instrumental.
not
Thank you.
normative
Yeah,
rationality.
that's it. Yeah, the
Yeah.
instrumental reason, right? And modernity is very much about instrumental reason, right? And the Nazis, in a sense, are very modern in the sense that they're great manifestation of instrumental reason. We want to get rid of the Jews. Let's just, X, Y, and Z. Wow. But like, what kind of goal was that, right? So
Yeah.
I think so. Courage, in a sense, or the underlying sort of attitudes of the person by which we would describe a person as being courageous have to be, again, not tempered by, but measured against other virtues like truth and justice. And there's also another hadith I wanted to mention in which the Prophet says that, human beings are like the metals of gold and silver. The best of them in the Jahiliyyah, which was the time of ignorance and idolatry before Islam, are the best of them in Islam. إِذَا فَقِهُ, if they acquire deep understanding of religion, i.e. wisdom and knowledge of truth and knowledge of the correct ends. So we see in the history of Islam, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph, was one of the greatest, Muslims and the greatest heroes and so forth of Islam. But he started out as one of the greatest enemies of the Prophet and of Islam. And in his kind of pre-Islamic ignorance, he was a tough guy and he was courageous, in a sense. And so this hadith is saying that people are like gold and silver, right? They come with these sort of qualities, which we can look at saying, okay, that is sort of an objectively good quality, or could be if it's directed towards the right end. So someone like Omar, who was very firm in what he believed and tough and willing to kind of take risks in order to implement it, those are all good, but they have to be directed towards the right end. So the best of people in the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic time of ignorance, are the best of them in Islam if they إِذَا فَقِهُ, if they acquire deep understanding and knowledge. So I think that is sort of, for me anyway, seems to be the resolution, of this, right? That there has to be that wisdom, there has to be that understanding, and of course, in light of, for us as Muslims, in light of the sacred law, right? And the limits of God's limits as expressed in the sacred law.
And also intentions, pleasing
Yes,
God sincerely. So I'm going to ask Alan and Father Thomas Joseph if you have any other questions or any other last words. Our 30-minute discussion is pushing an hour, and I suspected that it would happen after having listened to your presentations, and I still have many questions left, which unfortunately will have to go unanswered. Alan, would you like to offer any last thoughts?
Yeah, I have I have a lot of questions. Well, no, I have no final thoughts.
What? Well, you said you have a lot of questions. Maybe you could ask one of the questions, and we could ask the students to puzzle it out.
I don't know if I can put it into words. I'm troubled by a famous article by the moral philosopher Susan Wolf called Moral Saints, in which she basically says that people like us are boring, that this heavy concern for the quality of morality, the cultivation of virtue, the focus on an ultimate end, on a kind of strenuous and austere life in which natural expressions of virtue, natural achievements of satisfaction or happiness and so on are disparaged because they're insufficiently informed by an intention toward the ultimate, because they're not metaphysically serious. She says this is, these are grim people, and there's something troubling about elevating this as having a monopoly on what it is to lead a serious life. So I find this troubling, in part because I agree with it.
Yeah.
I mean, I have this colleague and I worked out this paper for a project at Yale Divinity School called Joy in the Good Life. And what I found was that through dwelling on the book of Ecclesiastes and then looking at the Jewish tradition, there's really a tremendous tension between like just joy, just eating and drinking and having some release in life and being with the ones you love, and what Judaism calls simcha shel mitzvah, the joy of the commandment. And only the joy of the commandment is the true joy, you know. And everything else, Maimonides calls it the joy of the gut, you know, the joy of your belly. That's how Susan Wolf would sort of take a sledgehammer to that. And I have to wonder whether, thinking about courage relative to the intention that intends the object toward which one orients oneself in a courageous way, how far that paradigm ought to go. I mean, because basically what it says, it's sort of hyper-Kantian in the sense that if you just do stuff out of the moral goodness of your heart, that's what Kant calls pathological, right? It has to be all the time, you know, the categorical imperative. You have to constantly be putting your maxim to the test of the categorical imperative. Who can live that way? Really, who can live that way? So, yeah.
That's
my question. Who can live that way?
Wow, and I'm going to link to Susan Wolf's essay. Is that happiness and meaning, or which one is that?
Moral saints.
Moral saints. All right. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Well, that's an important corrective, Father.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a real. It's sort of a Nietzschean.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure it's a corrective, but anyway, it was.
Well, your comment is something I think that we need to think about. I mean, in other words, is Nietzsche's complaint about the Enlightenment and so on also applicable to people like us? Father Thomas White, what do you think?
Well, yeah. So that's about I think what Nietzsche would call the boring will to truth in people, which is a little different than trying to figure out the truth or the meaning of things. It's a kind of a moralistic obsessionism in a variety of people of intellectual ilk, religious and non-religious, and it's a kind of heavy morality about the truth, including the truth of intentions. Look, I mean, my kind of last thought on all this is there are clearly deep connections between the three moral visions we've heard today about the virtue of courage. I think you, in your last comment about certain forms of Islamic versus Christian militancy and the ultimate end being pursued, and does it color everything? I think there's two things to think about that are very pertinent for all three religious traditions, but they may come to slightly different ways of thinking about them. One is how does one who is Jewish or Christian or Muslim grant great value to authentic acquisition of intellectual, artistic, and moral virtues in people who are not religious or who don't identify with the religious traditions, or indeed who are in religious traditions that are monotheistic? How can we respect and appreciate the realm of the human and the flourishing of what's human and beautiful, perhaps liberating in a multitude of ways, in domains that are not initially or even eventually on monotheistic soil, but they're part of this mysterious and vast world of creation that's beautiful and interesting, and therefore should be valued. And I think each tradition has its own way of thinking about that, some of which overlap, no doubt. But then the other relevant question is, how do we think of each other? Because obviously we all claim, in some sense, overlapping sources of revelation and differ, in very profound ways, obviously, also about the content of what's revealed in the nature of God and the eventual destiny of the human race, insofar as we have slightly different or very different sometimes conceptions of the revelation or of God. So we have a lot in common, and we have some things that are very important that we differ on. And I think each tradition has to think about that on their own terms, and in terms of orthodox fidelity to divine revelation as understood. But from the Catholic point of view, I think we want to be able to appreciate what we think is the true and legitimate orientation towards God in Judaism, and in a different way in Islam, that can be seen to be in some sense in harmony with and convergence with Christian understandings of the moral life, the virtuous life. So that's a really important and delicate, and I think really slightly understudied question, is how do we legitimately try to figure out in our own traditions, and maybe even share reflections with each other about how much do we think the others can live virtuous lives, and in what sense, and under what conditions, and how do we go about thinking about that? And I think it's a challenge to each of our traditions internally to try to, tease out a more full-fledged theology of that question. It's not the work of one person, it's the work of the broader traditions. So it's really salutary to have three people from these three traditions look at these virtues, because you have to think about both those things simultaneously: the appreciation of fortitude or courage in, let's say, non-religious or non-monotheistic people, and then the appreciation of harmonies and contrasts in the other traditions that appeal to a kind of common source of revelation, but in obviously differentiated ways. So I think these kinds of conversations are very important at the heart of a liberal culture to authenticate the importance of religious reasoning about public, engaging in public reasoning that is also religious reasoning in a respectful way of the Orthodox traditions, and also in a way that shows the capacity of the Orthodox traditions to engage with all the range of questions of public reason. So in that sense, I think this is a very salutary exercise. That's really basically what I wanted to say.
Well, that's a great note to end on, and I want to just end with saying that it's really fascinating what the point that Alan brought up is not only how does it impact, let's say, one's relations with others, and that's been a theme throughout every one of the conversations we've had, but also how do we ourselves stop, avoid becoming boring? In other words, how do we ourselves avoid, missing something important in life while we try to be good people and please God? So it's a really interesting balance, and something hopefully we can explore in further conversations. God willing. Thank all of you. Oh, yes. Yeah, please.
I wanted to, just on that point, and it came to my mind when Alan said that. I do think there may be a way to, what Susan Wolf says is is a legitimate critique, right? And I think there is a way to kind of bridge that, which is that, it is possible, I think, to be metaphysically grounded, but to have a room within the metaphysics itself, if we can put it that way, for things like joy, for things like relaxation and so forth. And I think in Islam, that's actually quite explicit, because the Prophet, again, who Muslims view as the kind of ultimate exemplar of virtues and of the right way to live, himself was known to always be smiling. He was not this sort of dour, scowling figure. He loved to play with children. He would joke with people, old women and, children and his, male companions and so forth. Things like even the Prophet's companions were surprised because they were told that they would be rewarded for having intimate relations with their wives. And they said, what, one of us, we're just sort of releasing our desire. Why should we be rewarded for that? And the Prophet said, do you not see, if you were to do that in an unlawful way, that you would be punished, you would be morally culpable. Likewise, if you do it in a permissible way, the way that God has prescribed that's pleasing to him, you will actually be rewarded for it. And so even things like, lovemaking is actually considered an act of worship. And there is this notion that, also the Prophet's companions said to him one time, we feel like hypocrites because when we're with you, O Messenger of God, and you're preaching and giving us, admonition and explaining the revelation, we feel very close to God and very spiritual and very holy. So, but then when we leave and we go to our own business, we kind of come back to this world and we forget about this and we're far away. And he basically said, well, that you have to be like that. That's what it is to be human. Right. And so you preach for some time and then you let up, because people are not made to just be in this kind of hyper religious, quote unquote, mode the whole time, strictly defined. And he said, if you were to be like that, then God, you would basically be angels, you wouldn't be human beings. And then God would get rid of the angels and bring human beings like you, who kind of go through these sort of different modes. So I think there is a way of kind of taking a step back. Kant, maybe not, it's categorical imperative, Kant anyway is very sort of dour and arid and dry anyway. but I don't think the kind of authentic religious traditions, at least I don't think, sort of a full kind of understanding of Islam, not just as a kind of legal tradition, but in its fullness, as a spiritual tradition, as a way of life, so on, as a communal kind of endeavor. I think that there is a way that, that can not only be incorporated, but that's actually at the heart of the message itself. Not to say that religious people often forget that and become these kind of scouring, dour, kind of moralistic browbeaters or whatever. But I think it's easy to kind of make an argument that itself is a deviation from the kind of the prophetic norm. I'll just
Thank you. Yeah, I heard Sheikh Hamza Yusuf say one time, I've had enough of you frowning Arabs. Why don't you smile sometimes?
I mean, look, I think you could go on offense with Susan Wolf's point too and say the immanentism of secularization is very boring. It's a very boring world. I mean, there's the boring saints of secularism are more boring than the religious saints. And the paragons of virtue in the liberal secular world are very dour and very moralistic and very aggressive and often less intellectually explanatory of their own position. So, look, I mean, the problems are deeper human problems about having some kind of, legitimate horizon of hope that gives life levity, and expressing that in a lot of instantiated ways. So I don't think that just being secular gets you out of the problem of, not averting to religious revelation makes you a more interesting person. I think it actually makes you often a kind of banal consumer who lives a boring life of sensualism and kind of immanentism, and they can be very moralistic at the same time. We can be very moralistic at the same time that we're not very religious.
Yeah, and in fact, that was Nietzsche's original target. I think was the Enlightenment folks who were secularists, but who were cold and and boring.
I read a very good book last year that I recommend that's sort of on this theme. It's by a husband and wife couple with the last name of Story. It's called Why We Are Restless. And it starts out with Montaigne. So Montaigne's immanentization of satisfaction, Pascal's response to it, Rousseau's response to Pascal, Tocqueville's response to Rousseau. It's really good. Recommended.
We will link to that in our course for the students who would wish to get it. We've held you guys here for so long, and thank you all so much for this fascinating conversation. It clearly could go for another hour. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful exchange. Thank you so much.
Okay, all right. So we've that's it. We'll cut this part off. I just again want to say to all of you, thank you. How do you guys think that went? Was that fruitful? You think?
It was a real good conversation.
Yeah, it's excellent.
Yeah,
very much.
What
Thank
did you think,
all.
Ismail?
I thought it was beautiful. Really, one of the best ones we've had so far. This is turning out to be an extraordinary series of conversations, and I'll make sure that all of you have login credentials to come in and see the final product when it's up and running. All right.
great.
All right. God bless all of you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so
Have
much.
a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Take care.
All right.
Thank you, Father.